6 kilometers from the Persian line, Macedonian scouts reached a low ridge and stopped. What lay beyond it wasn't just an army, it was a statement. Stretching across the open plain was a force so vast it seemed to blur into the horizon. A carefully assembled war machine under King Darius III. The ground itself had been leveled, cleared, and prepared for one purpose: to give that massive army every possible advantage. This was no accident. This was a battlefield chosen with intent. Alexander rode forward to see it for himself. He commanded roughly 47,000 men, seasoned, disciplined, and loyal, but vastly outnumbered. Across from him stood perhaps 100,000, drawn from an empire that spanned continents. Cavalry filled the wings. War chariots waited on the flattened earth. Every element of the Persian position signaled the same message: this is where your campaign ends. For 3 years, Alexander had pushed deeper into Persian territory, winning battles that built his legend. But this was different. There would be no maneuvering around this confrontation, no easy retreat. Behind him stretched hostile lands. Ahead stood the full weight of an empire, ready and waiting. The situation was brutally simple. If he won here, the road to the heart of Persia would open, along with its unimaginable wealth and power. If he lost, everything, his army, his ambition, his very name, would be swallowed by the dust of this plain. By the time Alexander stood on that ridge and looked out over the vast Persian army at Gaugamela, this was no longer a bold campaign driven by youthful ambition. It was a venture balanced on a razor's edge. Everything that had come before had led to this moment, and everything that followed would be decided here. 3 years earlier, in 334 BCE, Alexander had crossed the Hellespont into Asia with a force that many considered too small for the task ahead. He wasn't just invading territory, he was challenging the most powerful empire the world had known for over 2 centuries. At the Granicus River, he proved for the first time that Persian forces could be beaten in open battle. It was a sharp, decisive victory, but in truth, it was only an opening move. The Persian Empire absorbed the loss, regrouped, and prepared for a larger confrontation. That confrontation came at Issus. There, Alexander faced Darius III himself for the first time. The odds were again against him, but the result was unmistakable. Through speed, precision, and an almost reckless willingness to strike at the heart of the enemy, Alexander shattered the Persian line and forced Darius to flee the battlefield. It was a psychological victory as much as a military one. The King of Kings had run, abandoning his army, and in doing so, he revealed a weakness that Alexander would never forget. But victories like Granicus and Issus, impressive as they were, didn't finish the job. They were battles of movement, encounters shaped by opportunity and timing rather than deliberate preparation. Persia still stood. Its administrative system remained intact. Its wealth, vast beyond imagination, remained untouched at its core. And as long as that wealth existed, so did the empire's ability to rebuild. Alexander understood something that many leaders never fully grasp. Winning battles is not the same as winning a war. Armies require more than courage and momentum. They require funding, logistics, and sustainability. The army he commanded had been built by his father, Philip II, through years of reform and investment. It was one of the most effective fighting forces of the ancient world, but it was also expensive. Maintaining it required a steady flow of resources, and by the time Alexander reached deep into Mesopotamia, those resources were running thin. Persia, on the other hand, had what Alexander needed most: gold. Enormous reserves stored in cities like Babylon and Susa, wealth accumulated over generations, enough to finance not just one campaign, but a lifetime of conquest. This wasn't simply about expanding territory anymore. It was about survival at a strategic level. Without access to that treasury, Alexander's campaign would eventually grind to a halt, no matter how many battles he won. And so, Gaugamela became unavoidable. Darius had learned from his previous defeats. He would not be caught off guard again. He gathered forces from across his empire, men speaking different languages, drawn from distant provinces, united under one banner. He chose the battlefield himself, selecting open ground where his numerical superiority, especially in cavalry, could be fully deployed. He even had the terrain leveled to ensure his war chariots could operate without obstruction. This was not a reaction. It was preparation. It was intention. Alexander saw all of this, and he understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't just another engagement. This was a deliberate attempt to end him. Walking away wasn't a real option. To retreat would be to surrender the initiative entirely. Darius could shadow his movements, cut off supply lines, and turn the vast geography of the Persian Empire into a weapon. An army that large cannot survive long without stable logistics. Hunger, exhaustion, and desertion would do what Persian swords could not. Slowly, inevitably, Alexander's force would disintegrate. Staying put without fighting wasn't any better. Every day spent waiting would favor Darius, whose army was larger and better positioned. Time was not neutral. It was an asset that belonged to Persia. So the situation resolved into something stark and unforgiving. Alexander had advanced too far, committed too deeply, and invested too much to turn back. He had, in a very real sense, removed his own exit. The only path forward was through the army that stood before him. This is the kind of moment that defines leaders, not when options are plentiful, but when they are gone. For an audience today, especially those who have built businesses, taken risks, or navigated uncertain ventures, the scenario feels familiar in its own way. There comes a point in any serious undertaking where retreat is no longer viable, where the cost of turning back outweighs the risk of pressing forward. At that point, success depends not on avoiding danger, but on confronting it with clarity and precision. Alexander's situation at Gaugamela was exactly that kind of moment. He was operating in hostile territory, with no reinforcements coming, no fallback position, and an opponent who had spent months preparing to destroy him. The margin for error wasn't small, it was non-existent. And yet, this is where his greatest strength began to emerge, not just as a warrior, but as a strategist. He didn't need to match the Persian army in size. He couldn't. What he needed was to understand the problem better than his opponent. To see not just the battlefield as it was, but how it could be shaped, manipulated, and ultimately controlled. Every decision from this point forward would carry enormous weight. Timing, positioning, and discipline would matter more than raw numbers. Because in the end, Gaugamela wasn't going to be decided by how many men stood on each side of the field. It was going to be decided by how those men were used, and by whether one leader could outthink another at the exact moment it mattered most. There, on that open plain, with the fate of his campaign hanging in the balance, Alexander faced a reality that was as simple as it was unforgiving. Win, and the doors of an empire open. Lose, and everything disappears into the dust. Standing on that open plain, Alexander wasn't just looking at an enemy. He was looking at a problem that demanded a precise solution. This was no longer about courage or momentum. It was about understanding the strengths on both sides and recognizing the narrow path to victory hidden between them. What Alexander commanded was not a large army by the standards of the day, but it was an exceptional one. At its core stood the Macedonian phalanx, a formation that had been refined under his father, Philip II, into something close to a machine. Each soldier carried a sarissa, a pike nearly 18 feet long, held in tightly packed ranks that projected forward like a wall of iron. Against infantry, it was devastating. Against cavalry, it was nearly impenetrable. Advancing slowly and deliberately, the phalanx didn't rely on speed. It relied on discipline, cohesion, and the ability to grind an opponent down once contact was made. But the true edge of Alexander's army lay on the right wing, where he personally commanded the companion cavalry. These were not just mounted troops, they were shock forces, trained to strike with precision and overwhelming impact. Armed with long lances and organized into wedge formations, they could punch through enemy lines at critical points. For 3 years, they had proven themselves in battle after battle, and they had never failed him. Between these two elements stood the hypaspists, elite infantry capable of moving quickly and adapting to changing conditions. They served as the connective tissue of Alexander's army, bridging the rigid strength of the phalanx with the mobility of the cavalry. It was a balanced system, flexible, disciplined, and led by a commander who understood how to use each piece. Across the field, however, Darius held advantages that were impossible to ignore. His army was not only larger, perhaps twice the size, but built for the very terrain on which they now stood. The Persian cavalry, drawn from across the empire, was superior in number and had room to maneuver. On open ground like this, cavalry could dominate, sweeping around flanks and attacking from multiple directions at once. Then there were the scythed chariots, fast-moving vehicles fitted with blades designed to tear through infantry formations, and even war elephants, a rare and intimidating presence meant to disrupt and frighten. Combined with Greek mercenary infantry and the sheer scale of his forces, Darius had constructed an army that, on paper, should have been overwhelming. And that was the heart of the problem. A direct advance across that plain would play directly into Persian strengths. The moment Alexander's line moved forward in a conventional attack, his flanks would be exposed. The Persian cavalry, with its superior numbers and open space to operate, would extend beyond his lines, surround them, and crush the Macedonian army from multiple sides. It wouldn't matter how strong the phalanx was or how skilled his cavalry might be, once enveloped, they would be cut apart piece by piece. Alexander understood this with absolute clarity. This wasn't a battle he could win by doing what had worked before. The usual playbook, advance, engage, break the center, would lead to destruction here. The terrain, the numbers, and the enemy's positioning all pointed to the same conclusion. If he fought this battle on Darius's terms, he would lose. So the challenge became something far more complex. He needed to fight a battle that didn't yet exist, to reshape the engagement in real time, to create conditions where his strengths could matter and his weaknesses could be minimized. It required patience, control, and a willingness to take calculated risks under pressure. Because at Gaugamela, the question wasn't whether Alexander's army was good enough. The question was whether it could be used in a way that made enough irrelevant. Alexander didn't need more men. He needed a better question and a sharper answer. Standing on that wide, prepared plain, he understood that a straight fight would end badly. So he chose not to give Darius the battle he expected. Instead, he began to reshape it. His solution was deceptively simple and extraordinarily difficult to execute: an oblique advance. Rather than marching directly toward the Persian center, Alexander angled his entire line as it moved forward, drifting steadily to the right. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like hesitation or even confusion. In reality, it was deliberate, controlled, and precise. Every unit had to maintain alignment while moving across open ground, keeping cohesion under pressure. This wasn't just maneuver, it was discipline under tension. The purpose of that angled movement was to force a reaction. If the Persian left held its ground, Alexander's right would extend beyond it, turning the flank and threatening the entire position. Darius couldn't allow that. To prevent being outflanked, his commanders had to match the movement, stretching their own line farther and farther to the side. And that was exactly what Alexander wanted. Because as any experienced operator knows, whether in business, markets, or conflict, when a system stretches, it weakens. Depth becomes width. Reserves thin out. Communication strains. Small inconsistencies begin to appear. What once was solid becomes fragile in ways that aren't immediately visible from the outside. Alexander wasn't trying to overpower the Persian army. He was trying to pull it apart. As the Persian line extended to keep pace, gaps would inevitably form, not large at first, not obvious, but real. A separation between units. A momentary lack of cohesion. A place where command and control were just a little less certain. That was the opening he was looking for, and he was willing to wait for it. But waiting came at a cost. While Alexander shifted right, his left wing, under Parmenion, was being left exposed to enormous pressure. That flank would bear the brunt of the Persian cavalry, which outnumbered it significantly and had both the space and the momentum to press the attack. Parmenion's orders were clear: hold the line at all costs. Do not break. Do not retreat. Buy time. This is where the plan moved from clever to dangerous. Everything depended on timing. If the Persian line stretched and the gap appeared before Parmenion's position collapsed, Alexander could strike with concentrated force and drive straight toward Darius. But if the left gave way too soon, if the pressure became too much and the line broke, Then the Macedonian army would be enveloped, and no success on the right would matter. It was, in every sense, a calculated risk. Alexander was betting that he could read the battlefield faster than his opponent, that he could sense the moment when tension turned into vulnerability, and that when that moment came, he could act decisively enough to exploit it before the window closed. For a modern audience, the pattern is familiar. There are moments in any high-stakes endeavor where the safe path guarantees failure, and the only viable move is one that carries real risk. Not reckless risk, but informed, deliberate, and timed with precision. At Gaugamela, Alexander wasn't gambling blindly. He was engineering a situation where a single, well-timed decision could outweigh every disadvantage he faced. All he needed now was for the gap to appear. When the two armies finally began to move, the scale of the moment became undeniable. This was not a clash of skirmishers or a meeting of advance guards, it was the collision of two worlds. Alexander's line advanced steadily, but not straight on. As planned, it drifted to the right, measured and controlled, every step calculated. Across the field, the Persian army adjusted, stretching to match him, just as he intended. The tension built quickly. Everyone on that plain understood that once contact was made, there would be no easy way out. Darius struck first. The chariots came forward in a thunder of hooves and iron, blades spinning from their axles, designed to tear through the Macedonian formation and break it apart before the main lines even met. It was a dramatic and terrifying sight, meant as much to intimidate as to destroy. But Alexander had anticipated it. Light infantry moved ahead, targeting the horses with javelins and arrows. At the last moment, the phalanx opened lanes, creating controlled gaps that allowed the chariots to pass through without shattering the formation. Those that made it through were quickly surrounded and cut down. Within minutes, what had been intended as a decisive blow became a failed spectacle, leaving wreckage scattered across the very ground prepared for Persian advantage. But that moment, as dramatic as it was not decisive. The real battle was unfolding on the flanks. On Alexander's left, the pressure was mounting fast. Persian cavalry, superior in number and maneuverability, began to press hard against Parmenian's position. What started as probing attacks quickly escalated into full engagement. The Macedonian left was being stretched, bent, and tested at every point. Units were forced backward, formations strained, and in places, Persian horsemen broke through entirely, pushing toward the rear. Smoke began to rise from the baggage area as the situation teetered on the edge of collapse. Alexander could see it happening. He knew his left was in danger, but he also knew that reacting too soon would cost him everything. If he turned back now, the opportunity he had been creating would disappear. So he stayed the course, continuing the rightward drift, waiting for the one thing that could justify the risk. Then it appeared. Not a dramatic opening, not a clean break, but a subtle separation in the Persian line. As their forces stretched to match his movement, coordination faltered. A gap formed between the extended cavalry wing and the central command around Darius. It was small, fragile, and temporary, but it was enough. Alexander didn't hesitate. He gathered the companion cavalry, formed them into their wedge, and led the charge himself. This wasn't a general issuing orders from a distance. This was a leader at the point of contact, driving forward with everything he had. The wedge slammed into the gap with concentrated force, supported by elite infantry pivoting to reinforce the strike. Momentum built instantly. The Persian center, already strained by movement and confusion, began to give way under the impact. Dust rose in thick clouds, choking the battlefield and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Men fought in fragments, unable to see beyond a few yards, guided more by sound and instinct than by command. Through that chaos, Alexander drove toward the one objective that mattered most, Darius himself. The Persian king was not far. His royal guard held their ground, fighting to protect him, but the pressure was relentless. Macedonian cavalry pushed closer, breaking through layers of defense. In that moment, the battle balanced on a knife's edge. And then Darius made his decision. He fled. Whether driven by fear, instinct, or the sudden realization that he could be captured or killed, Darius abandoned his position and rode from the field. It was a single act, but it carried enormous consequences. In an army built around the authority of its king, that authority had just vanished. Word spread quickly, even through the confusion. The king had left. And with that, cohesion began to unravel. Units that had been holding their ground started to break. Soldiers who moments before had been part of a vast, organized force now faced a different reality, one where survival mattered more than formation. The Persian center collapsed, not from total destruction, but from the loss of command and confidence. And yet, even in victory, the situation remained fragile. On the left, Parmenian's forces were still under severe pressure. The Persian cavalry there had not immediately broken, and for a time, it looked as though they might still turn the tide. Alexander was forced to make a critical choice: continue pursuing Darius and risk losing his own army, or turn back to stabilize his line. He chose to return. The companion cavalry wheeled back across the battlefield, reinforcing the left and finally pushing the Persian forces there into retreat. Only then was the outcome secured. It would later be remembered as a brilliant victory, and it was. But what often gets lost is just how close it came to failure. A few minutes earlier, a slightly different decision, a delayed reaction, or a stronger stand from Darius could have changed everything. At Gaugamela, Alexander didn't just win. He won on the edge of collapse, and that made all the difference. What followed the dust and chaos of Gaugamela was not just a victory, it was a turning point that reshaped the ancient world. In the days after the battle, the consequences unfolded with remarkable speed. Babylon, one of the greatest cities of its time, opened its gates without resistance. Soon after, the vast Persian treasuries at Susa fell into Alexander's hands, delivering the immense wealth he had long needed to sustain and expand his campaign. What had once been a risky invasion was now fully financed, transformed into an unstoppable advance. Darius, meanwhile, fled east, no longer as a commanding king but as a man trying to hold together what remained of a collapsing empire. His authority, once absolute, had been shattered at Gaugamela. Satraps who had once followed him without question began to waver. Eventually, betrayal came from within his own ranks. In 330 BC, Darius was murdered by one of his own commanders, an ending that reflected the very collapse that began the moment he fled the battlefield. The Persian Empire, which had stood for over 200 years, did not fall in a final heroic stand. It ended in fragmentation, in lost confidence, in the absence of leadership when it mattered most. And at the center of that collapse stood a single decision made in the heat of battle. For Alexander, Gaugamela was more than a victory, it was the defining moment of his life. He would go on to campaign for years, pushing deeper into Asia than any Greek leader before him. But never again would the stakes be this high, or the margin for error this thin. If you found this story insightful, if it made you think differently about leadership, timing, and decision-making under pressure, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There's more to uncover from history's greatest turning points, and each one still has something to teach us today.